Once upon a time there was, and maybe there still is, I'm not entirely sure what happened to it, a division of Activision called Activision Value Publishing. This entity existed primarily to produce low-budget video games. Games like the ones in the Kabila series, which I now realize is a chain of outdoor activity apparel stores with hunting, fishing, camping, and so on. And it also produced a lot of FPS games. Low-budget FPS games. How low budget, you may ask? Well, I think it's worth pointing out that at some point, Activision Value Publishing was the publisher for big rigs over-the-road racing, which some may say is the worst game ever published. So why am I bringing up Activision Value Publishing now of all times? Well, you see, a lot of the games put out by Activision Value Publishing were made here in Romania. It, alongside Ubisoft, was one of the major driving forces behind the inception of the video game industry in our neck of the woods. It was a long time ago, a time that many have forgotten, and because they have been forgotten, I think it's worth bringing up the subject now and again just so that we remember. Because as I pointed out in that year-long series, it is the doom of men that they forget. Secret Service in Harm's Way is a special game. Not because it's brilliant, not because it pushes the boundaries of anything or other. It's important because this was the first FPS made in Romania that was sold on an international market. The first first-person shooter, if you will. There had been a bunch of other games made locally which were distributed in other countries, again by Ubisoft and Activision Value Publishing, but they tended to be a bit more of a niche thing, like submarine hunting simulators or 4x4 racing games branded after a chain of outdoor activity apparel stores. But this was an FPS. This was an FPS during the Counter-Strike craze, and it looked like it a bit. It didn't mean to. That was just a consequence of what it was, a modern shooter set in, let's say, real-world locations with maps that kind of look like they're taken out of an alpha version of Rainbow Six Siege, and an intro that oddly resembles the one from Modern Warfare, though a lot shorter, much shorter. Before going further, I must highlight two very important things. This was a game developed in 2001. Technology was not what we see it to be today in video games. Also, it was a low-budget game. So it was never going to compete with stuff like Halo or Grand Theft Auto 3 or Metal Gear Solid 2, all of which came out that very same year. It couldn't. Maybe with some more development time it could have turned out differently, but this was made in just 7 months. So please keep that very much in mind as we go forward. Secret Service in Harm's Way was developed at a studio called Fun Labs, which is, I wouldn't say it's popular in Romania, mostly because they don't actually put out games. They mostly handle development for other people's games. They lurk in the shadows and make assets and programming and basically do outsourcing for other studios and other games, some of which are quite large and popular and well known. But since they haven't made their own games and in the last couple of years haven't even put out anything for a publisher like they used to, they're not what you would call a household name around here. Still, a long time ago, they pitched a demo of a project called Broken Balance to Activision. It was for a first-person shooter, not one like Secret Service. This was more in the vein of Half-Life. It was a more sci-fi first-person shooter, which they kind of did get to make in some way a year later with a game called Revolution. But the demo itself was enough to get them the contract for Secret Service in Harm's Way, which was developed by a different team than the one that actually made the Broken Balance demo. And this team was composed of people like lead designer Dan Dimitrescu, which is a name that you may be familiar with. Some of you because you recognize the name as that of the big lady from the last Resident Evil game, and also because you have maybe played Door Kickers. He was kind enough to give me some insight into how Secret Service in Harm's Way was developed, and I'm very grateful to him for that. He also asked me to tell you to go check out Bear and Breakfast, which is a sort of tycoon game developed in Romania, where you play as a bear setting up a bed and breakfast. The combination may seem odd to you, it doesn't if you're from Brașov, or basically anywhere where they cut down all the forests and now the bears are all living in town, and some of them are opening hotels. You may be seeing some similarities here and there between Secret Service and Door Kickers, and that's mostly because the intention for both of them was kinda similar, and that was making a game like Rainbow Six. Now this was in ages long gone when Rainbow Six was a tactical shooter, not a multiplayer shooter where they keep removing windows and doors and adding stairs where there weren't any, just so it's easier to rush with Ash at every objective. It was in a time when a tactical shooter meant you had to take a methodical approach instead of rushing in and trying to mow everybody down. It was a game where you would die in one hit. At best, you maybe had 2 hits in you, but after the first one, you couldn't even walk straight. You'd often have to restart missions after just taking one single hit, even though you were still alive, because you would not be able to walk straight enough and aim well enough to actually finish the mission. Now, that kind of design may sound a bit aggravating, especially since there's no save game option, but the missions are not all that long. There is a timer at the bottom of the screen which, should you understand what you have to do and where you have to go, will often not reach 10 minutes before you're done with the mission. Not to say that the game isn't long, because sometimes you will not know exactly where to go, because although there is a minimap in the game, none of the objectives and none of the characters are actually shown on the minimap. There's just the skeletal framework of the map itself, which is useful to you if you memorize the layout from the briefing screen. The game also harkens back to an era of a different mindset when it came to map design. This wasn't a holding your hand directed approach. There was no cinematic at every 20 paces. The entirety of the environment was open to you. You could sort of approach the objective in any way you wanted to. There was a sense of freedom to the game that, playing it now, makes it feel almost innovative compared to a lot of modern shooters, at least until they all started turning into open world games. And this leads to situations where you can finish some missions in a minute if you know what you're doing. Or you can approach the mission from various different points and have a different experience, well, not entirely, but mostly somewhat a different experience each time, or 3 times maybe. It's the kind of design that's sort of built in to a lower budget game. It's the same kind of freedom that Grand Theft Auto 3 gave you and Grand Theft 5 does not when it came to achieving objectives for your missions. The game just gives you a playfield and some tools and an objective, and that's it. It's a more economic way of designing a level, designing a mission, rather than having points at which a cinematic pops up or a character says something or there's a cutscene or something else happens. Not to say that there aren't such things in the game, I'll get to those soon, but they're not as prevalent as they would be in even contemporary games to this one. It was just cheaper to make it like that, but to make it actually excel at that would have taken a lot more time. Liberty Island from Deus Ex, this is not. But it does give you enough freedom to make you feel like you're the one in control. It will also make you very, very, very angry. Some would say that Secret Service in Harm's Way was the first Dark Souls game. Others would say that it's not really a first-person shooter, more of an overly aggressive whack-a-mole game. what I can say for sure is that the game kind of hates you to the point where some missions start with somebody aiming a gun at your head from a building on the other side of the map and is actively killing you or the person you're supposed to protect who doesn't have body armor, or your AI control teammates who die the second they spawn for various reasons. Again, this was developed in very little time, and a good portion of that time seems to have been taken up by actually developing the technology of the game. It's not super mega ultra, high budget glossy graphics and stuff, because again, low budget game, but it did have physics. The kind of physics you would see in that period of time that harkens a bit to Soldier of Fortune, where every enemy in the game reacts when they're shot to the point where they're shot. You'll see them limping, you'll see them clutching their shoulders, you'll see them do all sorts of acrobatics when they'll die, and you will see physics function in ways that not a lot of games of that time had. Not a lot of games that exist now have. Apart from one single level when for some reason the door is only open from the enemy side, basically every door in this game can be shot through and blasted to bits. I'm not sure if this has any sort of impact for you, but depending on your age, if you remember figuring out that you can shoot through doors on the assault map in Counter-Strike, or through that wall there with a high-powered sniper rifle and hit the enemy without them even seeing you, then this game would just blow your mind. You could shoot through doors, you could open doors by shooting them. There was no use button, you mostly shot them or bumped your head into them. And some walls, they could be shot through. I'm not sure if this is an issue with the game running on modern hardware, but the physics seem at some points a bit exaggerated and enemy movement is quite quick. I tried running this on an emulated system, but the best thing I could emulate was a Voodoo card with really low VRAM, so the game didn't run great, but it sort of felt like the enemies moved in the same really quick way, and the physics sort of worked in the same fast manner. So I think maybe this is how it worked always, making the game in places not necessarily a tactical shooter, although yeah, you can lean over every corner. It gives it more of a shmup feel as enemies dive at you in quick succession. But it is more than just a succession of quickly mowing down the bad guys as they move towards you in a horde fashion. This isn't one of those later sequels of Painkiller that were just that. In every map, most of the maps, there are people that you are not supposed to shoot. The first levels take place in the Middle East, and you will fail the mission if you shoot 3 innocent bystanders. And they're not specially marked, they're not obviously bystanders. You will absolutely accidentally shoot some of them, but you only fail at 3. I don't think the game was trying to send some political message with how easy it is to confuse a hostile for a civilian, an enemy from an innocent person. But sometimes they use the exact same model as for an enemy soldier on a civilian, to the point where I actually thought it was a bug and the enemy didn't draw their weapon. But it's not, it's on purpose. And in the later levels that take place in non-combat zones, where you're supposed to protect the vice president as he's attacked at a museum, all the enemies are dressed as guests and guards. And you have to figure out which is which. All the while, you still die in one hit, and so does your protege. The game does have a cheat code for making that protege invincible, thankfully, because otherwise the first mission would have been impossible. You can order them around, you can tell them to sit here and go there and crouch and get down and sadly not get to the chopper. But they will often bravely face down death, even if you don't want them to. And the enemies, they fall in 2 categories: completely oblivious and heat-seeking pinpoint cruise missiles. Your allies as well. In some missions you can have some other operatives with you. You can equip them. Hell, you can equip yourself with all sorts of gadgets and ammo and weapons, and it really feels like they try to make this have some variety to it when basically the gun that has a scope on it and a big enough clip is the one you're going to use most. Shotguns? No, too low range. Sniper rifles? Yeah, maybe not. You're going to fight things up close a lot and you need to fire quickly. Hell, most maps, the smaller ones, you're mainly gonna use an SMG and just aim down sights if something's too far away. Aim down sights! This is another feature the game had which wasn't all that popular back then. You can equip your characters with all sorts of different weapons, but don't really expect them to behave like they have different roles. You can just tell them to follow you to go to a place and kill a guy. But in the time it takes you to do that, they either did that themselves or they've died several times. The pathfinding, I have to say, tries to do its job, and it even tried to follow me up a roof a couple of times and only died the one time when it fell repeatedly from the second story. It is still, however, beyond the pathfinding that Daikatana shipped with, which made that game unplayable. The main purpose of your allies will, however, be, almost always, that of meat shields, because, again, you can die in one hit, two if you're lucky, so having somebody there to take the first couple of shots for you doesn't hurt. Doesn't hurt you, I mean, it hurts them a lot, and they can die permanently. And you'll see them in your roster that they are dead, killed in action. That doesn't affect anything. There's no overarching progression. There's no consequence for killing 2 civilians and losing 2 agents, for example, in a mission. I'm thinking that maybe at some point there was supposed to be, but there isn't. And all the agents behave the same. They even start shooting you if you start plugging them full of lead because they scared you. There's the veneer there of something other than a game where you run in and mow everybody down as quickly as possible because they will do the same to you. And in some points, in some missions, it succeeds in being that. In missions where you have to carefully decide who you shoot. But there's not really what you would call replayability in it, since the missions don't really offer that much to you. They mostly offer you frustration, to be honest, especially since you can't save, and some of them can be a bit long, and again, navigating through the levels can be often annoying, with things like apartments on the second level of a building not having any actual means of getting to the first level other than jumping out of the balcony. And there are people in that apartment, and it makes you wonder, how did you get here? Do you break your legs every day going shopping as well as you jump from the balcony? And, well, every mission goes the same way. The last one seemed to me like it would be the most interesting one. You were in the White House. You find a dead agent. Their gun is missing. All you have is a pistol. The president is gonna die if you don't find the gunman. He's right upstairs, door to your left. Always will be there. Always will be the same person. Takes you 20 seconds to finish that mission. The cinematic before it is longer than the mission. It's one of the, I think, 3 cinematics that the game has. The first one being the one with the car, which resembles one from Modern Warfare. The second one being one with some helicopters, which again reminds me of Modern Warfare. Was this a prototype for Modern Warfare? Did Activision rip off their own game? Now, you may be thinking that the story sounds interesting. I mean, you start in the Middle East, there's an assassination attempt at a museum, and you end up at the White House with somebody disguised as an attendee to a party trying to kill the president. The story must be good at least. No, there really isn't much of a story. There's briefings. There's a lot of briefings. They put a lot of effort into actually making you think that this is building up to something that any of this matters. You have maps, you have pictures, low-res grainy pictures of characters. You have background information for them. You have all that, but there is no real strong overarching plot because it got taken out. There was one. It involved there being a traitor inside the US government, a senator, but 2 months before the game shipped, 9/11 happened, and ideas of sedition in that particular moment in time in a game that is so strongly, and I mean immensely, patriotically dressed as Secret Service in harm's way would just not fly. So instead you got what story the game has now. Would the original plot have made it a better game? Well, not really sure. There are parts of it that I think could be really good, like the mission where you have to get your protege onto Air Force One and then secure the plane and make sure nobody blows it up. The plane, by the way, looks pretty much exactly like you see it in Rainbow Six Siege, and I mean exactly on the inside. All the parts are there to make this map, this mission great, but it never manages to be as engaging as I think it could have been, had it been slower. And again, I have tried this in 3 emulation methods to get it to run at maybe the speed it would have had back in the day. I even capped the frame rate at 30. It only worked at 60 because the NVIDIA frame cap seems to be more of a suggestion anyway. So what I'm saying is that Secret Service in Harm's Way isn't necessarily a classic. It's not a game that maybe you should track down because you just have to play this gem that time forgot. I would say it's more of a historical curiosity for the people who live here. Because hey, again, this was one of the first commercial FPS games made here. It's part of our legacy. It was plastered on the cover of a couple of local video games magazines. It's, again, for something developed in 7 months, 21 years ago, okay. It's better than the last 2 Medal of Honor games, to be honest, or Battlefield 3. You have definitely a lot more agency than in most similar games of the current era, and kind of the same amount of bugs. There's just, well, kind of no reason to play it. There's nothing that what I would call universally required for gracious living or something or other in it. I mostly made this video for me, for the 5-6 people in Romania who still watch this channel, which is half our audience, to be honest. I made it so people would know that, hey, look, we made a shooter as a people. We actually made a bunch of them because after this one came its, well, Secret Service is part of a trilogy. There's 3 of them. The other ones I don't think were made at all by Fun Labs, but it has a sort of a, not a sequel you could call it, it's something else. It's called Shadow Force Razor Unit. It was made using basically every asset created for Secret Service in Harm's Way. They made it in a month, and it has been described to me as being more polished and having new gameplay. I haven't played it, but you just know that at some point it'll show up on this channel. And yes, it was also published by Activision Value. If you stuck around to the end of the video, thanks. And also I'd like to share with you some plans for the future. Namely, next month I'll be in a, well actually no, it's this month, I'll be in a game jam that is going to be about Romanian folklore. I may try to cover some of the games that result from that game jam on this channel. Also, I recently remembered that about 5 years ago I made a promise that every December 1st I would do a show about Romanian games, and then I forgot and nobody reminded me because currently I think most people watching the channel are my cat. So look out for some kind of video like that, maybe as a compilation or some individual episodes somewhere in December. Also, I've made some progress on Quack Job. The progress being that I realized I don't really like Unity all that much, but then again I've not really put in that much effort into actually learning how to develop in it. But it's still coming in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sometime in the next decade. Quack Job is gonna be right there, made with an even lower budget than Secret Service in Harm's Way, and with a lot less skill. Goodbye, everybody.